Well, good afternoon. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today. I am going to be providing an overview of education funds, and I want to thank Julian Guerrero, Director of Office of Indian Education, for inviting me to speak to this awesome group of individuals, and also to Donna Sabis Burns for inviting me to speak to all of you. There are poll questions that I've prepared, and it'll be nice to hear, to see the responses to those questions. So let's begin. I'm going to provide an overview of the work of the Office of Inspector General and go into further explanation of education funding as it relates to coronavirus money and state and local programs. So our agenda today, I will just provide a brief overview of the OIG, the Office of Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Education. I'll talk about the coronavirus funding legislation. As you're probably all aware, initially it was the CARES Act, and now we have two additional pieces of legislation that have passed: CARISA, which was in December of 2020, and then also the recent legislation in March 11th of 2021, the American Rescue Plan. And I'll provide an overview of some state and local programs, discuss some fraud cases, and also how to report fraud. And in between this presentation, it's in the attachments that have been provided for this session, but I did add additional slides that I'm going to show you that relate to coronavirus funding. So I'll minimize this presentation when I get to those and discuss that information. So just to give you, in case you haven't had any experience with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General, just want to give you background about us. As with all inspector generals, we were created as part of the Inspector General Act in 1978. So the goal of the Inspector General Act was to create an independent component within each department of the government. And that component was to look at any allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse related to each agency's programs. So our OIG is comprised of audit services, information technology, audits and computer crimes investigations, which is ITACI. And as you can imagine, this unit is pretty busy right now. Their work involves doing data extractions, looking at information that's provided from external organizations, also internally at department systems. They pull all that information together and support the work that they're doing, and also the work of our auditors and investigators. And I'll talk a little bit about how we use that information for our cases. And then investigation services, which I am a part of. Investigation services, to give you some background on that, is comprised of federal law enforcement officers, and we have extensive training in criminal and civil law. So to give you a background about me, I worked for the organization, the OIG, for approximately 28 years, and I retired in 2017. I was a manager and special agent in charge, and then I was hired back as a rehired employee in October of 2020 to specifically do outreach and to take a look at all the federal education coronavirus money. And so our outreach efforts are to talk to the stakeholders, which would be you, to talk to local education agencies, to talk to colleges, talk to institutions of higher education. And so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that that's a part of the work of our unit, and I'll get into the Special Investigations Unit in another slide here. But investigation services, we conduct criminal, civil, and administrative investigations. There's federal student aid fraud. There's different schemes that investigation services will take a look at. Now, what happens with the work of the agents that I'm referring to, myself included, is oftentimes people will send in information to the OIG hotline, and they'll think that something is a problem, or they think it's a fraud situation. So the work of the Office of Inspector General is to take a look at any information that's provided to the hotline and make an assessment to look at it to see if there is actually potential for criminal civil investigation. But we do take a look at those complaints and make an assessment of them. And oftentimes we receive allegations that are either not substantiated through our work, and our role as agents is to conduct investigations to gather the facts for any matter that's brought to our attention, and then to present that information to a prosecutor either at the federal, state, or local level. So going along with that, we also coordinate our work with federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, and also with federal prosecutors at the U.S. Department of Justice, but we do work with the District Attorney's Office and with the Attorney General's Office. And as I mentioned, a big function of the investigation services for within the OIG is the OIG hotline. And I will, throughout the presentation at the end, there's slides that provide information about reporting information to our hotline. A big portion of our work is that we coordinate with the department to develop enforcement actions and we provide recommendations to the department on any program vulnerabilities that we see during the course of our work. And that's often a really important aspect of our work. We get to work a lot with the various components like the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education, Federal Student Aid, and any number of the components within the Department of Ed. The Special Investigations Unit, which is the unit that I mentioned that I work for, this unit was created this past summer, actually summer of 2020. And the reason the unit was created is to actually take a look at all the misuse, potential misuse, theft, or any potential issues related to coronavirus funding that had been provided under the CARES Act. And obviously since then, as I mentioned, we have the Coronavirus Response Supplemental Act, the CARISA Act, and American Rescue Plan as well. So the unit was created in response to the funding that the legislation that was provided under the CARES Act, but our mission is ever evolving, and a good portion of our mission is to actually go out and do fraud awareness briefings or briefings about the potential issues that may come up with this funding that stakeholders should be aware of. So I wanted to also show you, this is a updated map as of today related to the regions that in the states that are covered by the Office of Inspector General. So the green here is the Western region, and it kind of explains it on here. And then the color here is the Midwest. And we recently had a reorganization, so that's why this map has been updated. But we now have a southwestern region, and then this is the southeastern region. So recently there was a split. They were previously combined under one supervisor, and they've now split that area. And then we have the eastern region, and then that's also includes our headquarters operations. So this is just to give you an idea. It's a slide that came from our audit division. The auditors and technical assistance division, they often give briefings on state and local programs, but I like this slide to include it just to give people an idea of how much we're talking about in terms of the state and local programs, how many programs there are. There's over 100 programs, at least 45 billion annually. And there's, all these public schools, private schools. And again, this doesn't even cover the institutions of higher education. So it's of awesome responsibility. And I think for what you do, the primary focus is amazing. I mean, your work is to help students, to help grantees, to help people get funding from the U.S. Department of Education. That's why I always enjoyed working for the agency, because it's such an important mission. The work to be able to give students money so that they can further their dreams and is very important. So our audit division just put in here, obviously they have a function to look at grantees, internal controls. They often do external audits. They do audits of various Department of Education components. Within investigation services, we don't have those same responsibilities, obviously. Our work focuses on the area of looking into matters that involve potential fraud or or civil matters. So this first briefing here, I'm going to talk about the pieces of legislation that were created under the various acts. The first one being the CARES Act. So as you're aware, the CARES Act was created and signed into law on March 27th, 2020. So during that time period, at that time, it seemed like, wow, this is a lot of money. We're giving $30 billion, and they created an Education Stabilization Fund, the ESF. And it's a lot different than when we created under the ARA programs back in 2008 and 2009. That was not new programs. That was funding, as you may recall, if you were working in this field at that time, it was funding that was provided, additional funds that were provided for programs that already existed. So Congress, under this legislation, they created, there was four different programs that were created under the Education Stabilization Fund. And at the time, they said, wow, this is significant. We really need to help all these different entities and organizations out there related to what was happening with coronavirus. So the first program, one of the main programs, is the ESSER Fund, and you're probably familiar with that. And that involves that was $13.2 billion for funding related to the K through 12 entities. Then we had the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which we often refer to as GERF. So I'm spell them out, and then I'll be using the acronyms, and everybody has a different acronym. I found when I talk to people at different state education agencies, when we do our briefings, when I talk to institutions of higher education, everyone has different shortened names. Instead of saying elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, which is pretty long term, so we call it the ESSER Fund. And then, like I said, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which was the GEAR Fund. And that was $3 billion that was initially provided under the CARES Act. And so for this one, there was three ways that the GEAR money could be distributed by the governor's office. And they could be provided to institutions of higher education, to the state education agency, or to another educational entity. So there was a lot of discretion that was provided in terms of what that meant and whoever was the most significantly impacted by the coronavirus situation. So this one has a lot of discretion, and it could be that people within the webinar that are listening to this webinar today and that are attending this meeting, your organization may have received a portion of GEAR funds. And then, of course, a big portion of the Education Stabilization Fund was the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which is HERF. So the two at the top, ESSER and GEAR Fund, as you're aware, those are administered by the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. That's a program office that oversees those. And then for the HERF Fund, it's administered by the Office of Post-Secondary Education. So they're the ones that oversee it. And what was interesting about HERF is there were a number of entities that were used to Title IV, the federal student aid programs, and they might not have had any experience receiving grants. So it was a whole new area for some of the IHEs, as I call them, institutions of higher education, that had never dealt with grants before, smaller IHEs that never had grants. And so this is a whole new situation, or it was back in March of 2020, and there's different rules, obviously, for grants. With Title IV, with federal student aid, as you may be aware, there's specific requirements. There's, for example, under the federal student aid programs, institutions of higher education are required to report to the department. They send in all the information related to each student and who they've given the financial aid to. Under the HERF program, the only requirement is to fill out quarterly reports and post those on the institution's website, but the actual students that the emergency grants are given to, that list of student names and information is maintained by the IHE. So there are situations where we have received information where we've had to go to actually the IHE and ask them through a request letter, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, we actually have to go to them and say, we need to know who you've provided your emergency grants to the students for. And the reason for that being, we don't have that information because it's not submitted. The actual student names are not submitted to the Department of Education, as you're probably aware. And then there are a number of ESF discretionary grants for higher education that are listed here, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on. You're probably already familiar with them. And then again, Bureau of Indian Education, under the CARES Act, they receive approximately $153 million. Again, here is the fund title that's very long: Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, which is, we just refer to it as CARISA. And that was signed into law on December 27th. And that provided another large amount of money, 82 billion. And that again was for the GEAR Fund, 4 billion, ESSER, 54.3 billion, and then HERF, 22.7 billion. And then I've listed out the other, significant, this doesn't add up to all the 82 billion. These are just the significant dollar amounts that were provided under this legislation. And then under the American Rescue Plan, the most recent legislation, there was 162 billion that was provided. Obviously there's a great need for this. There's a lot of lost revenue on the part of institutions of higher education, and also for K through 12 schools, charter schools, for all the entities that receive our money to get this funding so they can address what they need to do to help students. So in this, under the ESSER program, there was approximately 122.7 billion that was provided. And then under HERF, there was 39.6 billion. And I know that I've often received questions when we're doing these briefings. OPE is in the process of setting up the allocations for this program. So I know a number of IHEs are probably made aware through third parties what they potentially will be receiving. And I know that OPE will be they're working on those allocations as a, currently. They're also, as you know, they're issuing a lot of guidance, as well as the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And I did include that in as an attachment for a handout for you, in case you are, may need to know exactly the most recent guidance that's being provided. But I'm sure many of you are probably already aware of that, but I just like to include that with these briefings. So OPE is still working on allocations. It's a massive undertaking. And so again, they'll be informing the institutions of higher education what amounts they'll be receiving through the G5 system. And then the emergency assistance to non-public schools, and I didn't mention this, but that was created under CARISA, and that funding is for non-public schools, and there are specific requirements, and there's frequently asked questions that OESEs put out related to this. And so those I've actually put in, like I said, in the attachment. So that's 2.75 billion. And then the Bureau of Indian Education received 850 million. So these aren't all the sources of the funding, but these are the highlights of the funding. So before I go into the next, I'm going to minimize this one because I wanted to show you, and I'll see if I can get this to, I'm going to end the show and then call it back up so you can see my screen here. But I wanted to provide you with kind of what I've been, and I'm going to move this over so you can see it. And if not, I think I will minimize this and then I'll call this up. So here we go. I'm always having fun with these. Oops. Okay. So I just wanted to show you here, if you can see this. So this is
actually, sorry, Ms. Forbert. Actually, we
yes.
we can't see it right now, so you might have to do a new share.
I will do that. Thank you very much. It's like hold on one second. I'm going to minimize this. And I think what happens is if I, here we go.
Are you able to click on the share button at the bottom of your Zoom screen
Yes.
and then click on whatever the application or the document that you want to share?
Okay. Yeah, and I had it up and then it, so I might just resume this one.
Is there something you'd like me to bring up?
I can just bring up the actual presentation that I had up. So. So are you able to see it now?
Actually, no, I don't see it on the screen there. If it could be hiding behind.
Yes.
Are you sharing your screen or the slideshow?
I was trying to I was sharing the screen. So let me just pull this back up. Okay, here we go. There's like another little button here that I had to click on. So let me pull this up. Okay, so I'm back to this legislation. And what I'll just see if I'm able to call up the one slide that I wanted to show you that's in your handouts. And you get to look at my PC. This is fun.
If they're the handouts that are available in the Files tab, I have them handy here. I could also show them.
That'd be great.
Okay. Oh. So if you pause your share, I'll bring up the handouts on my screen.
Okay, great. I will stop sharing. Thank you for your patience.
Oops. Is this the one?
That's just an additional handout. That's a brochure, but there's a second thing that says additional slides. So that's great. You're showing them, which is nice. So.
Oh, sorry, right here.
That's the actual presentation.
The extra slides?
Yes, that's the one.
Nope.
So we'll just work with what we have. I'm just going to continue with the actual presentation. I think that's probably the best thing to do. It looks like the additional slides were not put on the site. So I can go ahead and if you want me to start sharing my screen, would that be the best?
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to have you pull it up again.
Okay, I think I have this.
That's it. Thank you. So we were just on the legislation, and I had gone through that. Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Am I going in the right direction? You can just tell me when to
Yes,
stop.
you. Okay, I will. Okay, and we talked about the legislation. Okay, and then we can, if you just go back one slide, that'd be great. Okay, perfect. Okay, and then the next slide. Okay, so what I was going to show you, and it's actually in the brochure that is attached, there are, and I have additional slides that I'll make sure are included so you can see them, but we have a snapshot of all the funding, and so it shows basically the total of all the money, and the brochure that they were nice enough to pull up here shows like graphically. I think when people hear billions of dollars, they say, oh my goodness, um, the numbers are overwhelming. And I think it often helps if you can see all the dollars that are out there just in a graph. And so our communications department came up with a graph that ends up showing all the funding by each of the programs that I just went over. And it shows the total of 4 billion for GERF, for the GERF fund, 190 billion, which is the ESSER program, which, that sounds like a significant amount of money, but if you realistically think about how many organizations that are out there throughout the US K through 12 that need that money, 190 billion is a large amount of money, but I think there's consideration even for additional legislation to meet the needs of our students and of our and of the schools. Also for HERF, the total is 76.2 billion, and that's going again to the institutions of higher education. But even that, if you think about it, all the colleges, I know I've done spoken with the tribal colleges and universities. I mean, there's 35, as you're aware, there's 35 tribal colleges and universities that are receiving HERF funds. But I think any entity is going to feel like, with everything that's taken place over the last year, we need additional money because we have to help students that are impacted by the situation that's taken place with the pandemic. And then the total for the emergency, that program that I mentioned to you, the emergency assistance to non-public schools, that total right now is 5.5 billion. And again, there's consideration to having additional legislation passed in the future, depending on what Congress decides to do. So I want to talk now about why entities and organizations could be targets of fraud. And we'll get into some case examples. And this is often a subject that, I like to, I want to mention this subject. Obviously, it's very important, but there's going to be points throughout the presentation where I'll talk about how organizations, even when you set up strong internal controls, there are people that get in positions of trust or people external to an organization that figure out ways to take advantage of the programs and to take money. And we obviously don't want that. We want the money to be there for the, tribal governments, to LEAs, for all the tribal colleges, universities, institutions of higher education. It's really critical that that money is there. But again, as the OIG, we want to give you examples of potential situations that have come up. And we even have a recent case that I will mention to you that deals with HERF, that involves students that have committed HERF fraud. So to go to the next slide, what is fraud? And I think people, pretty much you have a technical term. It's a deliberate distortion of the truth, but really what it is lying and cheating. And then why are you important to the OIG? And this, to me, is really significant. You play a critical role in helping us achieve our mission because you serve as the eyes and ears for the OIG to help us detect and prevent fraud. There's often times where once people know they've had interaction with our office, I would hope that individuals would feel comfortable to call there are situations that come up where somebody might say, for example, if you're in at a LEA, you're looking to uh, give out funding under a contract. And we have heard that there are, and it came up even, as you're probably aware, under the SBA program, when that money was being given out under the Small Business Administration, there were organizations that just started immediately that were not legitimate organizations. And we have, we believe that this possibly could happen again with our funding, where there's going to be vendors or contractors that you're going to need to vet through your whatever means you can to make sure they are legitimate, because you don't want them taking advantage of your organization, of the funds that you need to administer the programs. So that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that it's really important to open a dialogue. That's why we're doing all this outreach in the Special Investigations Unit. We want to get our name out there so that people feel comfortable to call in case they have some concerns and they want to discuss something. It's not a reflection on the organization. Even when you have situations come up where individuals are involved in fraud, either external or internal to an entity, it's not a reflection on that organization. Honestly, it's a reflection on the goals of that person to commit fraud. So I want to make sure I make that clear. And then the next, so what are responsibilities? And when I say SEA, obviously that's the state education agencies. This is just to give you an overview. What are the local education agencies' responsibilities? So this is not a listing of all the things that they do, because it's, they have so many responsibilities, but this is just kind of a quick overview. They administer ed funds, U.S. Department of Education funds, that, that's the federal funds they administer. Obviously, they administer state funds as well. And they're in the best position. I feel like you're in the best position in the work that you do to identify fraud, waste, and abuse if it's going to be happening. And you obviously maintain contact with the grantees. You accept applications for grant programs. You submit applications for grant programs. And one of the things that I included in the additional slides is the actual certification. I'm sure if you you weren't the person that signed the HERF application, the certification that went into Office of Post-Secondary Education, or if you were not the person that signed the ESSER application or the GEAR fund application, I would encourage you to take a look at it. But under that application, one of the things that is in the additional slides that I provided is the certifications say you are signing this under, you're making an honest certification here, and any false statement that's made is subject to 18-1001. And the reason the department included that is that's a standard certification now that's been included in all grant applications in any department. And then there's also, which I'll talk about some civil matters, but there's also the certification also references potential civil. So it's kind of uncomfortable to mention that, but that's just something to for you to be aware of. And also, if you haven't had experience dealing with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General, I know there's 2 polls out there, which I will be, taking a look at. But if you haven't had any dealings with our agency, just to be aware, under those certifications, it says that you are required to, if we come to you and request records, you're covered. There isn't a FERPA requirement. We're representatives of the Secretary of Education. We're FERPA exempt, and we're coming for a legitimate purpose to take a look at the program. And it could be, even if you're an organization, an institution of higher education, and you want to provide records to us. I've had this question asked a few times. People are familiar under Title IV that they can send stuff to the OIG, but under the grant programs, the same rules apply, that we are representatives of the Secretary of Education. So those certifications that are signed for ESSER, HERF, and GEAR, those also have a statement in there that you are to provide records. If the Office of Inspector General asks them of you, you are required to provide those to the Office of Inspector General, because I think it's important to put that in there, because sometimes organizations don't have any dealings with us and they think that they only have to provide it to the department or they need a subpoena, and that's not a requirement when you're participating in these funding programs. And that was the intent of Congress, to make sure. One thing I need to mention, when I talk about all the funding that's been provided, Congress also set aside money for various OIGs within each department to oversee those funds, to make sure that there's oversight of this money, to that, it's, any kind of things that come up. So we have, like I mentioned, the Special Investigations Unit, other people that are working on this type of funding. Our salaries are paid by that oversight authority. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that too, that there is oversight funding Congress intended for these funds to for them to be reviewed as necessary. And then again, as an organization, you probably have audits that are done, or you might conduct your own internal audits. And there's obviously, as I mentioned, when I talked about the GEER and ESSER funds, there's discretionary components within those that can provide, unfortunately, opportunities for fraud. And then to the next slide. So this one has a number of components, and you might have seen this. It's a triangle that's been out there. What's the motivation for why people might commit fraud? There's opportunity, motivation, or rationalization. So here's some fraud risk indicators. I'm not going to go over every single one, but I think it's difficult sometimes. I'm looking at some of the poll results here too. So hopefully, if you have additional questions, I'm going to save time at the end. If you have any specific questions, I see that there's some people that haven't had any interaction with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General, and I want to emphasize we're friendly. So I do want to make sure that you know what we do and how we can help you. And I'll obviously spend time afterwards to answer questions, but also I have my contact information, so you can feel free to contact me. So what are some of the fraud risk indicators that can take place? So here's some of the things that can happen. And I think I get this question because it's difficult if you're a small organization. And I don't know the makeup of everybody, in the audience, but I don't know the size of your organization, but it's really important that you don't have one person in control. And what I mean by that is you have to have separation of duties. So if somebody's administering the money, that's one aspect. If somebody, I recently talked to an IHE, they have all the duties separated, so there's a check and balance. And I think that's important to keep that in mind. Even if you, hopefully there's, funding to have, or you have enough people that you can do that, but that really is a key factor in preventing any kind of issues. And then these are just some types of things that we've seen in cases, questionable contracts, and I'll talk about some of the cases that have come up. Now, we haven't had any cases yet, except for the HERF program where there's been some fraud. We haven't had any prosecutions related to ESSER or GEER or anything like that. And that's why we're doing outreach, so we make people aware. Hopefully, we prevent some of that from taking place. But I'm going to give you some examples, because what we've seen is even if the program is different, the fraud scheme is similar. So what happens is people commit fraud, it's just a different program. So their methods are usually kind of similar. It's just that they really become program experts, and they figure out ways to take advantage. And again, I want to emphasize, this is not a situation, when I talk about the cases, it's not where somebody didn't understand the requirements of the program. We're talking about, or they thought it could be used for one thing and it was used for something else. We're talking about where they steal the money and they misuse the funds. And then there's missing documentation when you're looking at how monies are spent. There isn't documentation to justify it. For example, say that there's a technology purchase, and I'm just giving this as an example. If you have a technology purchase to buy computers, say you have a purchase order for 600 computers and you're using ESSER money for that, then you would expect that those computers are delivered and that you would have an inventory of those computers. It's not a situation where all of a sudden the computers aren't there and they weren't ever delivered to the school, those kinds of things. Unauthorized transactions and related party transactions. So just to give you an overview, obviously coming from the OIG's perspective, when we've had cases in the past, and like I said, I'll be talking about some cases briefly. What we've seen is there will be people will be in a position of trust. They could set up what the institution thinks is a legitimate vendor, and it turns out it's not a real vendor. It's a vendor that's been, the person that's making payments out of the LEA's account or any entity's account. They're funneling money through what is not a legitimate vendor, and they have a way to take that money and put it into their own account for personal gain. So, and I'll give some examples of that. I'm just trying to watch the time here to make sure I give you enough time for questions. And we'll go to the next slide. These have little graphs on them, so it takes a little bit of time to get through those. So what are some motivations? Unfortunately, when we have cases, we do see people have, these type of things, debt, addictions, they become greedy. They might start a legitimate business and then they end up committing fraud through greed. And then people try to rationalize it, that are in these, that end up doing this. I was only borrowing the money. It might start off that, they're taking some money that they shouldn't take. It's not like the profit. I'm not talking about the profit. This is funds money they should not get, and they take it and they say, I'm borrowing it. I was underpaid and I deserve it. Those kinds of things are what people, could potentially say, or they've said in the course of an investigation. And so we'll go to the next slide. Here's some of the charges that we end up using in the cases. Again, if we have a matter that's referred to us, we do an investigation, we work and get all kinds of financial records, we do interviews, and then all that information is presented to a prosecutor. They're the ones that make the decision on whether or not there's enough information and enough evidence to provide charges. We as the OIG don't do that. Our work is just to gather the facts, do the investigation, and present the information to the prosecutor. They're the ones that, make a decision if there's enough. And then oftentimes at the federal level, state level, there's a grand jury. Information could be presented in the grand jury. The grand jury decides if there's enough, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with grand juries, but in fraud cases, it works the same way. They hear from different witnesses and they make a decision whether or not to vote on a true bill, whether or not that indictment should go forward. That's the first process, the first step in an investigation. Then from an indictment stage, people are made aware that they've been indicted, and they have an opportunity to make a decision if they're going to go to trial or if they want to plead guilty. And that's every person's right. And we have to provide all the information that we have on the case. Agents are required to produce all their emails, everything. And I just like to mention that any information, it's called discovery, that's all processed through provided to the prosecutors. Everything on the case has to be provided to the individual that's been charged and to their defense attorney. They have a right to see everything. And I think everybody understands that. So these are just some of the charges that a prosecutor might use when they are doing any type of any of these cases. We'll go to the next slide. And then this is what I mentioned on the certifications for grant documents. You'll see this, you could be subject to Civil False Claims Act. And what civil cases are really preponderance of the evidence. It's not the same level of proof required for criminal prosecution. So basically it's the burden of proof is there's a preponderance of the evidence, and they don't have to show that there was a specific intent to defraud the government, but that actually the government was defrauded. There's for civil cases, that's done by a civil prosecutor, and their requirements are different in terms of how that investigation takes place. But again, it's just something to be aware of, that there are cases that you might hear of, you might have read in the paper, and it's a civil case. These are some of the things, the steps in the civil investigations. We'll go to the next one. So I'm going to give you some case examples. Okay, so this first case here, and this is a recent case, and after this case, I'm going to talk about the HERF fraud case that was just charged a couple of weeks ago. So this is a situation where it did not involve, I want to make clear, it did not involve ESSER funds, all the funds that I mentioned, but it did involve federal education money. And I put this case in here because this is an example of we're trying to show situations where we could have a person that's in position of trust, and they can do the same thing with the federal coronavirus program funds, right? So this is a case where it was a chief information officer. He was in a position of trust. He worked for the district for many years. It was a public school district, and what he did is there were flat screen devices that were required to be purchased, and he entered into an arrangement with a specific company. In that arrangement, they overpaid by each device. I think it was $1,800 per device that they overpaid. So how he was able to get away with it for so long is he made sure that all these purchases were under the $500,000 requirement where it would have to be reviewed by the school board. So this fraud took place, unfortunately, for 4 years. What he received in return was, the company that he entered into the arrangement with, he received $150,000 below value, market value for a house. He received luxury cars. His sons obtained jobs through this company. And so how they found out about it was when they actually had an audit take place and they discovered it. So auditors went in, they saw all these irregularities. And then again, it's just the person was just indicted. They were arrested just in January. So again, it's just the beginning of the investigation. But what they were charged with at the state level was bid tampering and unlawful compensation. So there's different charges, like I say, that can be brought forward on cases. And we'll go to the next case example. So this one is this is a charter school matter. And how this came to our attention is the Los Angeles Unified School District. They have an IG's office. And this was a great charter school. It was providing services to students. And what happened is the founder and ex-CEO ended up using her position to misappropriate approximately $3.2 million in public funds. So when this case first came into play, there was a lot of information that came forward during the course of the audit that was done by the LAUSD. And they provided this information along with a lot of additional information that was required to develop probable cause for a search warrant. And so a search warrant was done at this location along with the business office and a few other locations, the residence of the individual that was involved in the fraud. And again, just to give you an idea, a search warrant affidavit has to be reviewed by a number of people. It's usually very extensive. You have to establish for a fraud case, there has to be a lot of evidence. It's reviewed by a magistrate judge. They're the ones that make the final decision if there's enough probable cause to do a search warrant. So I think the point of this is to bring up this case is to show that during the course of the investigation after the search warrant, the actual charter school board was concerned that they wouldn't be able to have their schools function anymore. So there was an agreement reached between the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Attorney's office in LA, and also the charter school board, that they would be allowed to continue to operate, and the people that were involved in the fraud were no longer on the board. So I think it was a good situation where the schools still were allowed to exist and provide the services that were needed for the students. So this individual, in her position, she made a lot of personal expenses. There was inappropriate expenditure. She bought a production company in LA. And this is not like profit. This is, $3.2 million that was, public your taxpayer dollars that she took advantage of. And then she also bought a building in Ohio to start another business, which had nothing to do with Celerity Educational Group. So she was sentenced to 30 months. Again, not to get into all the details because I have a number of cases to go through, but the decision as far as sentencing, that's handed down by a judge, and it's based on your prior criminal record. And in this case, there was no prior criminal record, but based on a number of factors, she pled guilty. She didn't go to trial. So all that comes into play and determines how a judge will hand down a sentence. And so before I get into this charter school case, a couple things that I wanted to bring up on, I wanted to mention the HERF case that just was just indicted. We had a situation that's the first education coronavirus case that's been charged, and we had a matter where a college let another law enforcement agency know, and then they in turn contacted the Office of Inspector General. We had two individuals that were students at the school, but they stole the identities of other students, and they used the school's online portal to to apply for HERF grants to which they weren't entitled, and they falsified information. So they received HERF grants under the identities of other people. And again, this is money that's supposed to be there for emergency grants to students that need it. They have expenses. They've been, and this money was stolen from them. So that's why the dollar amount compared to some of the cases that I'm mentioning, it's not huge. It's not a huge dollar amount, but it's significant in the sense that these two individuals took it upon themselves to take advantage of a vulnerability in the system, and they stole people's information to get HERF money, which obviously we don't want to take place. So one of the things that I put in that at the end, and I just want to talk about it while we're going over cases, is, just some things to keep in mind. I don't expect you to be the fraud police. That's what I always say. You're trying to do a great job administering the grants. There's a lot of questions. I know I'm not a program administrator. I have to rely on OESE, OPE, all our program offices. But I think, when I talk about these cases, we're talking about situations where you can see it's not a misunderstanding about how funds should be used. These are people that are engaging in fraud schemes. Just some advice is to follow competitive bidding rules. I'm just want to cover some of these things, since I've had other presentations where people have asked to kind of go over this. Vet your contractors the best that you can, especially if you see that somebody just started their business. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but if all of a sudden their business is just starting and you have no way to check that business, just keep that in mind. Try to check vendors that are approaching you to provide services, especially given the amount of money, 282 billion that's out there. So that's what I mentioned previously, that SBA saw businesses that were just starting to exist once they knew that there was coronavirus funding out there. And unfortunately, it's sad to say this, but there's people that end up, doing this. Some of the things that I pointed out, I put the uniform code in there. And so things to keep in mind just when you're administering the grant is reasonable costs. What would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur a cost? And these are just kind of audit things to mention to you. And, a big part of your administration of your grant is effective control over and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets. And so you must adequately safeguard all assets and assure that they are used solely for authorized purposes. And these are just guidelines to think about when you're setting up your internal controls within your organization and you probably have already done that, but I wanted to mention those. And it is the actual uniform code, the CFR 200 is included as a link at the end of the presentation, so that and there's some other guidance out there as well. So to talk about this case briefly, Bradley Academy is a case that where you have three people that are in positions of trust. They're operating a legitimate charter school. Unfortunately, they need more money. They want, for whatever personal benefit, they wanted to take advantage of the program. And the CEO and principal and vice principal engaged in a scheme where they entered student information into the Arizona Department of Education's registration portal, which is the portal that's used to report on how many students you have. So they falsified information to make it seem like they had more students than they did. And they did this to the tune of 2.5 million. They received an additional federal and state funding. So there was the principal was sentenced to 3.75 years in prison. And there's other sentencings that are taking place in this case, but this was a case that was charged not at the U.S. Attorney's Office level, but it was charged at the Attorney General's office. And again, this was a case that was brought forward through an audit, through the Auditor General's office. They found that there was, they saw some irregularities, and then there was an investigation that was done. And so then the next case. So this is just another recent case of a routine audit that was done where a person is, again, an executive director in a position of trust. So for 5.5 years, this fraud took place, and from 2014 to 2019. And you'll see this if you work with the Office of Inspector General, the cases, because you have to do a thorough investigation. They take a long time. And you have to make sure you're getting all the information. There's all kinds of things that the attorneys will ask to have done in the course of an investigation. So this actual fraud took place over the period of 5 years, and the person stole 3.2 million. And all of it was, a lot of it was related to personal expenses, properties, other things. The person had a legitimate business, but decided to use their position after so many years to take advantage and to steal from the federal programs and also state programs. Again, this is not coronavirus funding, as you can tell from the years that the fraud took place, but we potentially could see this take place in the future with the funds that are available through the ESSER program and through the EANS program, the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools. And then we'll go to the next. So just to show you an example. This is a more recent case that this indictment happened in September of 2020. So this is a situation where we have a state education agency officials, the executive director, and they entered into a contract fraud. So the reason I included this is so you could kind of see, because I know there's a portion of ESSER, and I'm just bringing this up as, something to be aware of. There is a portion of ESSER now that organizations, and this was brought up to me actually by an SEA when I was doing a briefing, the state education agency said, under the American Rescue Plan, under the ESSER program, there is a portion that's allowed for construction. So I just bring this to your attention. This isn't a construction fraud, but we have had cases in the past where there's been construction fraud. So there was some concern expressed by the state education agency that there's clear guidance provided by the department, so that when a LEA enters into construction contracts, they understand what the requirements are. But again, that's a potential vulnerability, especially if people aren't familiar with the federal requirements for construction work or for construction matters. So in this case here in Mississippi, the person, they altered purchase orders, they split purchases, they split contracts into multiple contracts so that it would, again, it's not the same as the case that I showed you, the chief information officer, but these people are very smart that get involved in this type of fraud. They make sure that they figure out ways to, so to speak, they fly under the radar, because they split the purchases so that there isn't, they don't have to enter into the competitive bidding process. So this person conspired with these contractors so that they could actually go under that competitive bidding process, and they falsified and inflated quotes so that the contractor that was involved with the executive director in the fraud, they had the lowest bid, so they would make sure that they were awarded that contract. And then what happened is the executive director, how they got paid for engaging and using their position of trust, is they received kickbacks from the winning bidder, the contractors that they entered into the fraud scheme. So there was an estimated loss of approximately $650,000. This matter is still ongoing. They were charged with conspiracy because there were more than one person engaged in the fraud, bribery, wire fraud, and money laundering. So that's a more recent case. So what are some pathways to success? Again, these are just, I mentioned some of the CFR, the uniform codes. Try to do a fraud risk assessment, assess potential threats, create a plan to mitigate risks, ensure that there's adequate monitoring and oversight of the money. And I think that's, a challenge often when you have limited resources. But I think the importance of doing that, is probably clear with some of the things that I've brought up. If you are, see documents or things that look that there's something off with those documents, request additional information. I know you have a lot of responsibilities in your positions of trust in the work that you do, but again, if there's something that looks like it's questionable, ask for additional information. And then, make sure that you receive the necessary training and fraud awareness training. And I know that there's a lot of webinars out there. There's a lot of opportunities with the organizations that you belong to that probably cover these areas about internal controls and, potential fraud risks. And so this is just a citation here of something that you can refer to for managing fraud risks that's put out by the Government Accountability Office. And then how, stay current on all your communications with OESE, also with OPE. And I know you have program people assigned for each of your grants. And I know that I've heard that, there's people that ask questions. They will get back to you and answer your questions on how to, administer the money. And I know that they're also trying to offer webinars as well. And then we have here OIG's notification service for Facebook and Twitter. If you want to see some of the work that we're doing, the reports that we're issuing, some guidance that we're issuing, that's all on Facebook and Twitter. And we also have podcasts that we've done to talk about some of the matters that have come up in the course of our work. And so those are often interesting to listen to. And then, if you have something that you think is potential fraud, please contact us. But we ask that you don't tip off the people. If it's students, for example, if you're at a IHE, don't let the students know that you're contacting the OIG at that point, because we want to get the information and work with you, but we want to be able to do our investigation, and we don't want to have, we don't expect you to do a fraud investigation in your role. And then also, if you, just a recommendation to formalize a process for reporting potential fraud, waste, and abuse to the OIG. And I know that the department, OESE, OPE, they put on their websites, if you suspect fraud, waste, or abuse, contact the OIG. So I do have, and we'll go to the next slide. These are just some guidelines. Again, you want to protect the integrity of these programs, right? I mean, that's the whole reason why you do the work that you do. You want to help students, you want to help nonprofits, you want to help the organizations that you work for. That's why you're in this noble profession. We really do want you to contact us if you have any questions about potential, concerns that you have in terms of administration of the grants that you suspect fraud, waste, or abuse. And then just to make you aware, this is for federal employees, so we'll skip this one. Unless you're a federal employee, you're covered under the Whistleblower Protection Act. Just to make you aware that under the new legislation that was passed previously, and we put this in here, our attorneys, our lawyers have asked us to put this in there because it's important to let people know that if you report fraud, you have, that you're protected for that report, for reporting any kind of fraud. It covers federal contractors, subcontractors, grantees, and subgrantees. You can't be demoted, discharged, or discriminated against for disclosing, fraud. So this is the citation for the law. And again, this is a new change where it covers local education agencies. That could be teachers, it could be anybody within those entities. Previously, it was just grantees. Now it covers subgrantees. That was a big change that Congress felt was necessary to provide that protection, so that if people do have concerns, it might not even be fraud, it might just be on mismanagement of money, that they're protected for that disclosure. And then, as I mentioned, I covered a little bit of the Uniform Guidance, Section 200, but here's some additional guidance if you haven't seen it before, resources about managing, risk management and internal control. And I'm sure it seems overwhelming with all the work that you have to do, but it's just reference material for you to take a look at when you have time, to give you an idea, in your responsibility with discretionary grants and with grants, the types of things that you can, set up to hopefully prevent any potential issues in the future. But like I said, even when you do everything you possibly can, there's always a situation that there could be a situation that comes up where somebody takes advantage of that. Then we'll go to the next one. This is how to report fraud. and as I mentioned, our hotline. Then this has a link to our regional offices. And then after this is just when you report through the hotline. I know a lot of people feel comfortable because they want to, do things through the hotline. They want to report things anonymously, and that's certainly your choice. However, I've provided the regional contacts too, because we do protect people's information as we're required to. And then, so I will leave, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. One thing I just wanted to bring up, and I didn't mention it at the beginning, and I just really want to say I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for your patience when we were switching presentations. I do appreciate that. It's really, I'm going to close this out so you can see me, and I can, hold on one second, or I think I'm not doing you did such a great job. I thought I was still administering the presentation. I just wanted to mention, I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you today. And Donna kind of recommended that I mention this, but I wanted to tell you, your organizations are dealing with tribal governments, your tribal governments. It's so important that money is there for the Native American population. And I say that coming from my background. I'm a member of the Turtle Mountain Reservation, but that's really through my grandfather, who unfortunately was, experienced the Indian boarding school experience, which, is a part of our history, but through my mother as well. And I really feel like it's a great opportunity. That's why I hope that there's something else that I can do for you, your organization in the future. I can, I'm open to modifying a presentation just to talk about specific things that your organization would need. So I want to make sure I mention that to you, but I wanted to tell you that I really think what you're doing is so important. It's really a critical function in this country. You have a lot of responsibilities. So when I talk about all these things, recommendations, I know it's hard to fit everything in, but if there's any way that the OIG can help you, we're happy to do that. So if there's any questions that I can answer in the remaining time, I think there's like 8 minutes, left. If there's anything that I can answer, or if you want to, contact me in the future, please do so.
So I'm actually not seeing any questions in the chat box right now. But I can share that in response to the polls in terms of who joined us today, we had about it looks like four people from local education agency, a couple of folks from tribal government, and one charter school, and a couple from some BIE schools.
Great. Yeah, well, I really appreciate your time, and, continue to do the great work that you do. But if there's ever any questions, I know that there's, like I mentioned, there's a program contacts within the department, but if there's anything I can do, or if there's, any materials that I can provide that would help your organization, don't hesitate to ask. And like I said, there's my contact information. But it's interesting. I see the poll results on 40% have never heard of what we do. And so I think, the U.S. Department of Education, OIG, that's part of the reason why we're out there giving briefings to our stakeholders, so they know that we, what we do and how we can help.
That could be a really valuable resource. Thank you for making that available.
I'm happy to do so. Well, I think.
Sorry. I was just noticing that we do have a question here. If grantees see fraud with a state grant, would they contact you?
So if it's it involves a grant, we would be interested in hearing about it. And if it's not a federal grant, we still can, talk to you about it, and then make put you in touch with the appropriate person if it's state funding as well. So I just want to make sure I understand the question. If it's a state grant, you can still contact us, and we can help you, guide you in the right direction to this proper state agency. Again, oftentimes people see things and they don't know for sure if it's potential fraud. They might suspect it. And so that's what I want to make sure you understand, is that we don't expect you to know for sure if something's fraud or not, but feel free to contact us and we're happy to discuss it and to take a look at it.
Yes, and there was a clarification there too in the chat that yes, some Ed grants are awarded to states who run the competitions.
Yes, yes. So that would be, important for us to, we still would be involved in that as well. So please contact us if you have any questions about that.
Very good.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, but I just wanted to display your contact information one last time for folks up there. And also to let people know that we do have one final poll where you can rate our presentation and give us our stars. So we ask that you do that before you sign off of this presentation. You have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes before the next session starts. So a few things that you can do with that time. You might want to check out the social wall and see what folks are saying today about the conference. Engage in a chat on the discussion board. You can also access the materials and the extra handouts, and as well as the slides from this presentation in a couple places. You can find them in the Files tab, where you accessed our presentation and where you saw that live stream. You can also check out the resource library. You can find our resources from this presentation as well as other presentations in that area of the Pathable platform.
And I also just wanted to say, I have my email address on there, but if anybody needs my phone number, it's 202-286-6739. And again, feel free to call me as well, but a lot of times people feel comfortable with email, but my phone number is 202-286-6739. And thank you again for your patience and for attending this session. And good luck. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and good luck to you in all the work that you're doing. That's so critical.
Thank you so much, Ms. Forbert, for sharing that great information with us.